All right, so this is our fourth cells video. In the last video, we talked about how autotrophs are able to make sugars from sunlight through the process of photosynthesis. In this video, we're going to be talking about how we convert those sugars into a form of chemical energy that cells can use to do different jobs. The process we're going to be covering in this video is cellular respiration. It's how your body takes the things that you eat and converts them into actual physical actions. This is the process our cells use to make energy. This is also a process that plants use, or fungi, or dogs, cats, just about every type of living thing has to go through cellular respiration because it's how we take our sugars and get the kind of chemical energy we need. So what's the goal? What are our cells trying to make? The answer, ATP. We've talked about this previously. We've kind of introduced ATP before. But just a quick rundown on how this molecule works. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has a series of carbon rings here, and then there's these three phosphate groups. Those phosphate groups are linked together with bonds, and those bonds store energy. And if we break off a phosphate group, we release a whole bunch of energy from ATP. That then becomes ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, and we can put a phosphate group back on, charging the battery back up, in other words, and storing energy back in the form of ATP. So our whole process of cellular respiration is going to be about putting this phosphate group back on to make ATP from ADP and a phosphate group. Where is this going to be taking place? Two places specifically: the cytoplasm of the cell. So remember, the cytoplasm is that jelly-like fluid inside the cell. And then the mitochondria. If you have ever been on the internet before, you've probably seen the meme that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. And the reason we call them that is because they make ATP. That is their job, is to make a whole bunch of ATP for the cell. And because they're making ATP, which is the form of chemical energy cells use, they get the nickname the powerhouse because powerhouses generate electrical energy for cities. So some structures you might want to be familiar with: the outer membrane and the inner membrane. These folds in the inner membrane have their own name, which is the cristae. And then we have the matrix, which is basically like cytoplasm inside of the mitochondria. Mitochondria also have their own DNA sequence, which is kind of unique and special. And we'll be talking more about that in class as well. Okay. So let's do an overview of cellular respiration. This diagram, much like the diagram you saw for photosynthesis, is going to be the thing that you need to understand. This diagram is what you should be able to explain, label, and be able to go through. This is what you need to know. So here's what's going to happen. The cell is going to absorb glucose. It's going to bring glucose inside through the cell membrane into the cytoplasm. In the cytoplasm, we're going to do a quick chemical reaction called glycolysis. The glycolysis reaction will produce a little bit of ATP, but really what we want to get out of glycolysis is what we call pyruvate. And we're also going to get some electrons that are going to be carried in the form of NADH. Pyruvate is going to enter the Krebs cycle And again, just like the Calvin cycle we saw in photosynthesis, the Krebs cycle is a series of chemical reactions, and we're going to release ATP and carbon dioxide from the Krebs cycle. Then we're going to make some more NADH and FADH2, and those are going to be used in the electron transport chain, where we're going to bring in oxygen, and we're going to produce more ATP and some water. Okay, so let's break down glycolysis. Glycolysis is always the first stage of cellular respiration. This has to begin the process. So we're going to take glucose and we're going to break it apart into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid or pyruvate. It's the same thing. We make a tiny amount of ATP here, just 2 molecules, and we make 2 NADH molecules. And again, remember this occurs in the cytoplasm. Okay, when oxygen is present, pyruvate's going to enter the mitochondria. This will only happen if there is enough oxygen for this process to continue. If there's not enough oxygen present, we're going to have to do a different process, which may be at the end of this video or in our next one. So let's talk a little bit about the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle also has another name, the citric acid cycle. We make a small amount of ATP here as well, and we produce carbon dioxide. And again, this happens inside the mitochondria. So here's what the Krebs cycle looks like. Now again, we don't expect you to be able to remember everything on this diagram, but to give you some kind of context about what's happening here. Okay, so we have our pyruvates entering, we're going through these chemical reactions, we're producing some NADH and some ATP. Here is the kind of breakdown of what we're making. The CO2 is going to have to be released out of the cell. It's a waste product. And we have the energy molecules that we're going to carry over to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is where we make most of our ATP. This is the big thing we want to power. This happens on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, like right here. And it's going to actually be where we make our ATP. This will look pretty similar to what we saw in the light reactions in photosynthesis. It's a series of proteins that are exchanging electrons, forcing out ions to power ATP synthase. Those ions will flow back through ATP synthase and make a whole bunch of ATP. This is kind of an overview of the process. This chemical equation is the chemical equation for cellular respiration. And if you notice, it's the opposite of photosynthesis. The products that we get in photosynthesis are the reactants for cellular respiration, and the products for cellular respiration are the reactants for photosynthesis. All right, so this is all great and all, but what happens when we don't have oxygen? And that's what we're going to cover in our next video.